All right, so we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone to our, this is actually the 10th one that we've done. I know that whenever I listen to podcasts, they celebrate like the 100th episode or the 1,000th. I'm just happy to get to 10 with these. We've had a really good year with a lot of great book talks. And we're wrapping up this academic year with a great one. Daniel Morales-Doyle's Transformative Science Teaching, a Catalyst for Justice and Sustainability. So I'm really excited to have him. Let me do a proper introduction here. So I mean, I wrote this down. Okay. Okay. Thank you for joining us and happy Juneteenth, everyone. My name is Doug Larkin, and I'm the chair of the AERA Science Teaching and Learning SIG. And we're really glad that you're all with us here today. And again, this is the final book chat of this academic year. We plan on starting these up again in the fall. It is now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Daniel Morales-Doyle. Dr. Morales-Doyle is an associate professor of science education in the Department of Curriculum and Instruction at the University of Illinois, Chicago, and currently serves as a coordinator of the licensure strand of the MED Science Education program there. His research examines the potential for science education to act as a catalyst for alternative futures, and his work focuses on the socio-political dimensions of science curriculum, teaching, and teacher education. Before joining the faculty at UIC, he was a high school teacher in the Chicago Public Schools for more than a decade. Welcome, Dr. Morales-Doyle.
Thank you so much, Doug. I really appreciate you organizing these talks all year. I've been to several of them, and they've been really engaging and awesome. Hopefully I can live up to my end of the bargain here and be as good as some of the other authors that I've heard throughout the year. Thank you to everybody for making time too on this special day on the calendar to join us. I'm just going to start with a couple of slides. I promise not to take more than 5 minutes before then opening up the conversation. I just want to give you a sense of the goals of the book. So when I was a high school science teacher, I often used these composition notebooks as loud notebooks for my students, right? So I would go to the dollar store before the school year started, and I would buy a whole bunch, and then I would use the extras for my own journaling. And I start the book with this excerpt from one of those journals. Back in 2012, I wrote, "Entering into my 10th year of teaching, nothing continues to perplex me more than the various and multiple demands on science curriculum and teaching." So that's what this book is about. What should be our priorities as science teachers who care about equity, justice, and sustainability? And then how do we make those priorities come to life in our classrooms? So for better or for worse, a singular priority has really dominated science education, at least since about World War II. And that's been this metaphorical infrastructure that here in the 21st century, we've come to call the STEM pipeline. And in this book, I argue that we need to abolish the STEM pipeline. And that's because, well, there's several reasons, but one of them is that the pipeline really limits our roles as science teachers. It turns us into promoters of our content areas, champions of the enterprise of science, right? And so you can see this role illustrated in this kind of swag that's common in science teacher classrooms. My 13-year-old son really rolled his eyes when he saw that last one up there on the bottom right. But some of you would be thinking, hey, I have that t-shirt. What's wrong with that? And I'm not here to tell anybody that there's something wrong with encouraging students to engage with or even like your content area. But I am here to make this subtle distinction between encouraging engagement versus promoting the enterprise of science, right? There's a lot of issues with science. And if science teachers don't encourage our students to ask critical questions about science, then who will, right? So for example, if we teach about genetics, do we accidentally reinforce widely held false beliefs about racial differences or gender binaries? When we teach about the useful properties of chemicals, do we also teach about their environmental consequences that hit some communities harder than others, right? As we marvel at the effectiveness of vaccines, do we also caution about the disaster of synthetic opioids that have been developed and promoted by the same pharmaceutical companies, right? These are the kinds of questions I argue really need to be central in science classrooms. And so I want to contrast this swag here on the left of the slide with the gear worn by my colleague Nina Hike and the stickers on Judy Escamilla's computer. Nina's been teaching science here in the Chicago Public Schools for 28 years, and she was one of the teachers I looked up to when I started 21 years ago, right? And Judy just graduated from our master's program, and she did her student teaching with Nina. And so here we have examples of science teachers who want their students to nerd out and get into the science, but they're also taking critical stances that aren't always welcome in science spaces. And that connects with this special day on the calendar. In my view, the greatest achievement in human history is the way that Black and Indigenous communities in the United States and around the world continue to thrive in the aftermath of centuries of attempted genocide, right? Usually we hear about the greatest achievements in human history being scientific or technological advances, like going to the moon or developing penicillin, right? So as we commemorate Juneteenth today, we have an opportunity to think about the difference between promoting the scientific enterprise versus promoting the values of justice and equity that Nina and Judy were promoting in their classrooms. And that really helps us to put science education in its place. So when I say put science education in its place, I actually mean that as a question, as in, what is the place of science education, right? We have these incredible traditions in education from scholars, from organizers, from teachers and activists who view education as a process that's capable of changing the world to build more just, equitable, and sustainable worlds for people to live. Right? I'm thinking about the critical pedagogy of Paulo Freire, but also about W.E.B. Du Bois and Carter G. Woodson, who were writing about similar ideas decades before. Right? When we talk about the traditions of teaching to change the world, I think we need to mention the work of Septima Clark more often and foreground her work. Right? And these traditions have been carried on over generations. And my point here is not to flatten important distinctions or nuances, differences between these terms, but to point out that even as the terms change with the context and the times, there are connections, there are similarities, there are solidarities between what Eve Tuck and Kei-Wen Yang called diverse streams of justice in education. I'm taking a risk with this last slide because, of course, I have to leave important people out. And even more, when we get to this last slide, I know some of the folks on this slide personally, and they're humble people who I know would object to me putting them up here with legends. But my point is that there are these deep traditions of teaching to change the world, and even traditions of doing educational research to change the world. And they continue all around us, but as science educators, we've mostly avoided these conversations, right? And so the point of the book is that we have to engage with this question of how teaching and learning science might actually contribute to the transformation of society towards justice and sustainability, right? So when I talk about the place of science education being a question, that's just another way to phrase this fundamental question of the book, which is, what is the place of science education within these rich traditions of teaching for social transformation? And so I will stop with that and open it up to questions. I'll leave you all this slide in case you don't have the book yet and you would like to get it. There's a discount code there.
That's nice. You got a little 20% off there. All right. Well, thank you for that. I wonder if we could just start, if you could just say a little bit about the book itself. And so you've sort of set the table for the big idea in the book, but I wonder if you could just give us a little, for somebody who hasn't read the book yet, you have 6 chapters and you kind of have a theme for each. Can you just walk us through maybe 1 or 2 of those themes? We'll get to them, but just to give people a sense of the book.
For sure. So the first chapter is all about why we teach science in schools, and really asking readers to consider their reasons, their whys for teaching science. I tell stories about my own reasons for teaching science in there. Talk about how this saying that I'm fond of, which is that blankets cover, teachers transform, right? Sort of to remind us not to focus so much on covering the curriculum. Talk about putting the enterprise of science in political and historical contexts. Chapter 2 is really all about how we come to view our students as transformative intellectuals, what that means, some exercises for new teachers to think about reframing the problems of schooling. And chapter 3 is about what I've called social justice science issues, which to me really build on Paulo Freire's generative themes. They're kind of like socio-scientific issues, except for there's a greater emphasis on the local relevance of the issues and also the broader historical and socio-political context of the issues. Chapter 4 is about, if we're going to teach from social justice science issues, and we recognize that teachers have to be curriculum developers, but also can't be developing everything from scratch. How do we work with science curricula that are already out there in wonderful activities that we've probably all used in our classroom, but sort of reframing them, repurposing them to make the values and politics of science more explicit, to bring that into the conversation for students to consider. That builds into chapter 5, where I encourage all of us to teach students to like we want to inspire their wonder and joy about the world, about the universe, about the earth. And that's different from teaching them to love biology or love physics. Right. And so kind of thinking about how we engage differently with our disciplines, in some of the ways that I just talked about. And throughout, I should mention that I'm bringing in example lessons and stories from both my research and my experience in the classroom to try to make these things as concrete as possible and to inspire teachers to reinvent some of these ideas in their own contexts. Um, and so then the last chapter is about replacing this pipeline metaphor with my favorite metaphor as a chemistry nerd, which is as a catalyst for change. And so I get a little bit into what that metaphor means for me as a chemist, and also, somebody who grew up in a household with a father who's a community organizer, a mom who's a preschool teacher, and family that was always politically engaged, community engaged. How I think about that metaphor of catalyst for change. So I don't know if that's the
Yeah,
kind of
no,
summary you were looking for, Doug. I got
that's
slides from
perfect.
you too, but I'll spare you.
That's perfect. So I have a couple questions here, but I do want to encourage folks, if you want to, if you have a question for Dr. Morales-Doyle, you can put it in the chat, and I can either read it for you, or if you want to read it, that's fine. Um, uh, but I just want to start with a couple questions. And you mentioned your father, and there's a story in I think it's chapter 2 or chapter 1, page 18, where you tell the story about going driving at night with your dad, and he stops and has a video camera kind of in between the seats. And it sounds like, I'm not saying it's an origin story for your work, but it it kind of is, right?
Yeah,
Because you keep coming back to that event for yourself as a social justice science educator. I wonder if you could just share that part of that story now.
for sure. So we were on the way home. I think it might have been from a basketball practice or something, and I was a 10th grader. So I was taking high school chemistry, and my dad stops the car and pulls out a camcorder, right? This is mid 90s. So pulls out a camcorder from between the seats and starts filming this this place on the side of the road in our neighborhood, about a block and a half from our house, right? And what this place was a medical waste incinerator, right? And there was actually 2 medical waste incinerators in our neighborhood, attached to 2 hospitals, right? And the reason he was filming that was because he was part of an organizing effort in our neighborhood to shut down these 2 polluters. And the hospitals claimed that these medical waste incinerators would only operate at certain hours of the day, and rarely so, but they were kind of going all the time. And so he was documenting that here we were at whatever time it was of the day, and there was plumes of smoke coming out the medical waste incinerator. And so as a high school chemistry student, our neighborhood was trying to figure out what are the risks of having these polluters in our neighborhood. And my parents wondered whether my younger brother's asthma was impacted or caused by some of the pollution. And so my dad gave me these readings about how burning polyvinyl chloride produces these chemicals called polychlorinated dibenzodioxins, or dioxins, right? And he said, "You're taking chemistry, figure out what some of this stuff means." And I kind of looked back and said, "That's not what they teach us in 10th grade chemistry." But you mentioned an origin story. It was kind of like, well, but what if it was? That's not how science curriculum works, but what if that is how science curriculum worked? And so it's an example that I keep going back to through 20 plus years of being a science educator, because it sort of planted that seed about the possibilities for the ways in which science education might be more responsive to what communities are dealing with, and um, more consequential in our world, I guess.
Thanks. Well, I mean, one of the recurring themes of the book is this, well, not just this book, our chats all year, honestly, has been elevating the idea of studying science, studying the enterprise of science, um, and its intersection with human activity. In the same way, like social studies isn't just history, right? It's a study of a much broader system of activity. Um, and I guess part of, I think your argument about this why teach science is a rethinking of what it means to teach science.
Mm-hmm.
And it's very clear. I mean, one of the things I could feel like the tension as you wrestled with, like, you're putting, chemistry problems in the text, and students have to learn that if they're going to do this other thing. So I'm sure there's a question in there somewhere, but like, how do you think about that broadly? Like when you envision what what type of science class your 10th grade self might have returned to answer those kind of questions, like what might it have looked like and been different from the traditional, biochemistry, physics that students take in high school?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I have a little bit of an answer to that in the last chapter where, I studied chemistry. That's what my undergraduate degree is in. I taught mostly just chemistry for a long time. And I've gotten to the point where I'm ready to ditch it. Let's ditch chemistry, biophysics. That's just not, those are not the most responsive courses, right? And this may be controversial, and I've thought through how wide-ranging in ways that are problematic and also really exciting making this change would be. But I think we need to be teaching public health, equity, environmental science and justice, and science, technology, and society. I think those should be the standard. If we're going to have 3 science classes that everyone has to take in high school, I think those should be the 3, right? They're just more responsive to what our world needs. They're, if kids want to study chemistry, that's awesome. But they should do it in college. If they want to become a chemist, then they should study chemistry. Chemistry is just not the most relevant material that every 14 through 18-year-old needs at this point in life, right? In this point in our world. So for me, that would sort of be a starting point. And there could be lots of different ways to do that, right? But I guess I'm suggesting that, like, in a world where pandemic is a big problem, we probably need everybody to understand some big ideas about public health and vaccination and how that intersects with society and oppression and inequality. And we only need some people to get into like the deep details of like molecular biology and virology. And like, we should have a high school education that focuses on the former and provides opportunities to sort of encourage those who want to do the latter to do so, if that makes sense, as one example.
Well, I, just personally, I'm kind of on board with that idea. But I also, as a teacher educator, I can imagine, you're teaching your classes and somebody says, Dr. Morales-Doyle, this is all great, but what do I do Monday morning? Like I'm going into a cooperating teacher's class. I'm learning to teach in this traditional setting. Maybe they're not, but I mean that issue, and there is like the curricular adjustment pieces, but it feels like there's like a personal thing that has to change in somebody if they've grown up taking that way of learning biochem and physics. If we're talking about just high school science, of course this goes all the way down to the early grade levels too. But how do you talk about this with your students in a way that as you get into the last chapter, that keeping hope front and center, like how do you talk about this with them?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, so when I'm teaching new science teachers, one of the very first things I always like for us to do is to read science, technology, and society texts, right? Like the importance of technology in our lives is so front and center all the time that, again, that's something that can't be left out of the education that everybody gets. I think is a critical engagement with that technology. And so oftentimes new science teachers come to me because I teach in a master's level licensure program, right? So new science teachers come to me really enthralled with their disciplines and really excited to share their love for biology, chemistry, physics, etc., with their students, right? And so the first thing we do is say, let's look at some more complex views of the ways these disciplines operate in the world as a starting point to sort of start to problematize that, right? And that leads in lots of really exciting directions. And one of the things that I think you're alluding to, Doug, that it leaves them with is like this kind of deep tension about what to do tomorrow, right? And like how to reconcile the reality of the job of teaching science in a high school with these other kinds of lofty ideas, I guess, right? And so part of my answer to that is that's exactly where I want them to be, right? I think the most important thing a new teacher can learn is to live in constant contradiction with the aims and goals of schooling the aims and goals of education and how we grapple with that, right? So like I view schooling as fundamentally oppressive in socially reproductive institutions, and I view education as the most as holding more potential for transformation more than anything else that we do in our society, right? And so that's like a fundamental contradiction.
Sure.
And I think there's nothing more important that new teachers can do, or us more experienced teachers too, than like get used to living in that contradictory space, because that's the reality of our work, right? Is that we have to find ways to make the most of the transformative potential of teaching and learning, while also dealing with the realities of schools as very conservative institutions that are trying to reproduce a world that has been profoundly unjust.
Well, thank you, Daniel. The questions are coming fast and furious here, so I'm going to open it up. We'll connect Daniel to Daniel. Daniel Pimentel, would you like to pose your question or comment, or a combination of both there?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Well, to your point on sort of needing to navigate or live in the space of the tensions of education, my question, I think, maybe addresses the tensions and contradictions of science. But I do, not to be super long-winded, but I just want to thank you for writing the book. I was so fascinated the whole time by it. I said yes so many times to the critique of the STEM pipeline, the incorporation of STS, structuring the curriculum around more relevant topics. So all of that was just really wonderful to see. A question that came up for me, specifically in the Why Teach Science chapter, was really in this space where you say we want students to critique and challenge the scientific enterprise, but there is also this sense of, to an extent, wanting to help students trust the scientists and the scientific enterprise, to the extent that it can help us understand the world to some extent. And I felt like from the rest of the book, I got a clear sense of the engaging with the critiquing science. And I'm wondering what your vision for developing that sense of sort of a critical but justified trust in science might look like, especially in light of mis and disinformation that circulates, and just this idea that it's hard to even get to climate justice when we have groups and organizations just challenging like fundamental, consensually agreed upon ideas about climate change. And so I'm just curious how you think about all of this and living in those tensions and contradictions. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a really good question, Daniel. Thank you for posing it that way. I just want to acknowledge that it's a scary time as science educators to encourage students to critique science. Like when we have a presidential election happening and we have a climate denier and an anti-vaxxer in the race, right? Or at least nominally in the race, in the case of the prominent anti-vaxxer. I think that's a scary time to sow any seeds of doubt about some of the consensus science that you're mentioning, right? And so first, I think I just want to acknowledge that, right? That you're pointing out really clearly. One of my this isn't in the book, but one of my responses is maybe similar. There's two things I'm thinking about. One thing is a conversation I used to have with high school students who were like having a really hard time sticking with school, right? And because so many students experience school as such an alienating space, right? And such a repressive, oppressive sort of drag in their life, right? And so a lot of times as a high school teacher, I would pull students like that aside and ask them why they were there, right? Just like, why'd you show up today, right? And I think that question worked often for me as a teacher because it encouraged students to grapple with some of the contradictions that they were facing with school, right? A lot of times the first answer was because my mom made me, right? And so sometimes when you're dealing with a 10th or 11th grader, you look at them and you say, like, we both know people whose mothers would love for them to be here, who aren't here, right? And so what is it you know, that made you, like, let's dig a little deeper, what really made you show up? And students would start to raise some of those tensions of school sucks, and also, like, I see that it does have a potentially positive impact in my life, and there are aspects of coming to this place every day that I actually do like, and I do see potential for a change and transformation and good things to come out of coming here every day, as much as sometimes it sucks and I hate it, right? And so that would be a way in for me as a teacher to start to have a conversation with student about how to make the most out of school and how to sort of deal with some of the parts about it that suck, right? And so I sort of view the conversation about science being similar to that, right? Which is, if we really take a look at the enterprise of science in real socio-historical and political context, then we get to look at some of its warts under a bright light, and we also get to appreciate its achievements in a more accurate way, right? Like we have a more accurate understanding about how humans have built such an impressive understanding of nature and the universe and the world we live in. And we also get to see how limited those understandings still are and the oversights associated with them, right? And that more realistic picture of what the enterprise of science is, that's in like real socio-historical context, is for me the best way to develop sort of a trust that remains skeptical, right? The kind of trust and skepticism that we want students to have, right? So for example, in the chapter of the book, I write about how I used to have students read, and now the audio is available so you can listen to it. Dr. King's speech when he accepted the Nobel Prize, he gave this really incredible, it's not one of his better known speeches, but it's his Nobel lecture, right, when he got the Nobel Peace Prize in 1964. And so 60 years later, it really resonates. There's a particular passage that I include in the book that I encourage you to listen to. You can find it online, where he writes about the socio-political context. He speaks about the socio-political context of science and all of the contradictions of the amazing things it's accomplished and the horrible harms that it does, right? And so I think that's just the most realistic way. There's a scholar named Liliana Valladares who has an article called STS Vaccines in Science and Education a couple years ago. I think that's kind of how I'm thinking about it, is the way she writes about it there. That engaging with the enterprise of science, honestly, is actually the best way to cultivate the sort of skeptical trust that we're aiming for.
Thanks. Enrique, I know you said you're traveling in your comment, but are you able to ask your question, or if I don't hear from you, I'll go ahead and ask it. Okay. So his question is, what would be the dream approach to using your book in professional development for in-service science teachers beyond a book club approach?
Wow, that's a good question. I think so. I have a friend and colleague, Betsabe Torres Olave, who wrote to me after she read the book, and she said, "I'm so inspired to like get back into creating physics curriculum." And that was like the best compliment she could have given me. That made me really happy. And so I guess that's what it is, right? Like, I want the book to inspire your next best cool lesson in collaboration, right? I want folks, after they read the book, to reach out to community organizers in the community where they teach, to open up dialogues with students and parents to figure out what kinds of projects and lessons they want to do in their science classes, right? So it's that kind of collaborative work that I really want to encourage with the book, right? I hope that a little idea here or there in the book can become a project in a science class somewhere that's, you know, more impactful and creative than anything I've ever done in my career, right? I think that's the kind of thing we always want as teachers, right? We teach with the hopes that students will and really with the confidence, I think, that students will do really cool things that we didn't dream possible. And so, you know, thinking as a teacher, right? As an author, I'm thinking as a teacher, that's the kind of work I hope it does. And so, yeah, I want people to have study groups where they dream up their dream lessons, their dream projects, the things that would make them really proud as science educators, to look back on their career and say, like, we did that. That's how a lot of my work started. We have such awesome science educators here in Chicago, and we used to meet in my living room over the summer to figure out, what does this whole teaching science for social justice mean, and how do we actualize it? And so those are the kinds of groups that I hope can take up the work in the book.
Thank you. Simone, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, absolutely. First off, thank you. I just want to say, like, I obviously did not take anything from the book, like no point at all as I was reading. But I really, really enjoyed this book, and I think it got me just thinking a lot about my own research and what I envision as the future of science education. So I appreciate that. My question, I was really drawn to your example of your student who made the comment, like, I'm tired of doing the social justice shit, or it was something to that extent. And from like my own interactions with students when I was in the classroom and then doing my own research, I feel like sometimes what I met with from students and also teachers is this thought that school can be an escape from students' lives and what they're like, the hardships that they're experiencing, the injustices that are present in their communities and things like that. And I have found that a lot of students can struggle in doing this type of work because, like I said, they see it as an escape, and their teachers fear, and I've heard from teachers, like, I just don't want to induce any more trauma on students by like continuously bringing these things up and whatnot. So I would just love your thoughts on how you position, like, within that frame of mind that some students and teachers have, the importance and like necessity of doing justice-centered work, even when we as in students, when students and teachers like leave the school building and are going back home and facing these numerous injustices. And I appreciate it in the book how you alluded to like not focusing on deficit perspectives and really like positioning it from perspectives of dreaming and imagining futures. But yeah, I would just love your thoughts as to that.
Thank you, Simone, for your kind words and a really great question. This is a tough one. So I'll tell a story really quick that's not in the book. There was one year where I was teaching where, like, 3 days before the school year started, kind of for no reason, the district fired our principal. And the interim principal who came in, like, canceled like 80% of the AP classes that our school offered. There's a neighborhood school here in Chicago, and had seniors who had been in these engaging advanced classes before, like sitting in a room with a substitute watching Disney movies, because some of the teachers had sort of gotten fired along with the principal. And so the students, being that we were at a school that focused on social justice, sprang into action pretty quickly. They quickly organized a series of protests. They wisely reached out to some of the community organizers who had been involved in the struggle to found the school for advice, right? And so they mounted this really well-organized campaign to reinstate the principal and the teachers who had been fired, right? And so the dilemma that all of us teachers faced was, what do we do in our classes while all this is going on, right? And a lot of the teachers chose to directly put class time aside to discuss what was happening, right? And I was teaching AP chemistry, which was one of the 2 or 3 AP classes that didn't get canceled, right? And I had a really tough decision to make about whether to switch to talking about what was going on or to kind of keep going with AP chemistry. And I decided to kind of keep going, right? And I was conflicted about that. And later, talking to students about it, they told me 2 things. that made me feel okay about the decision, even though I'm still not sure all these years later if it was the right decision. One set of students told me that was my escape and distraction from all the stuff that was going on, right? Like we were like organizing protests. It was super stressful. We, you know, my friends didn't know whether they were going to be able to get into college the way their transcripts were impacted. You know, we were facing suspension and expulsion for the things we were doing. And like, then I could just go to AP chemistry and like nerd out about chemistry. And that was pretty cool. But a caveat to that is we were doing community engaged projects in chemistry class, right? We were actually studying the pollution left behind by the coal power plant that the community had gotten shut down the year before. So it wasn't this totally abstracted chemistry, but it was something different from like the daily struggle that they were focused on at the time. And then other students said, I'd love that we just kept going because it helped me feel like I still was a student, right? And I still got an opportunity to learn the things I was supposed to be learning. But I also saw you at the community meetings after school, right? I also saw you speaking out against what was happening in a public way, right? And so there was this sort of acknowledgement that we have to kind of do both, right? Like we can treat some of, you know, the nerdy science stuff as an escape sometimes. And we're more willing to do it with somebody who we see on the streets with us, who we see in the neighborhood with us, who we see caring about the things that we also care about. And then I think two other points I'll make, because it's a really great question. One is that I think this, one of the really important points that I was trying to make in telling the story of the kid who said, I'm sick of all this social justice shit, is that no matter how we teach, we're going to have a range of responses to it, right? Students are going to respond to it in lots of different ways. And that's really healthy, right? Because we're not trying to teach as an exercise in conformity. We want a range of responses. We want students to be inspired, engaged, maybe even turned off or pushed away in different kinds of ways. That's healthy. And the percentage of students who would rather leave all their troubles behind and like really geek out about the minutia of like electron configurations is a small percentage of the overall students, right? Which is how normal science class would treat this issue, right? And so like I feel like our classes can be justice centered and still provide that escape for those students who want to treat it that way. But like the vast majority of students who are dealing with tough stuff in their lives, that just seems like the height of irrelevance to them. Like, why are we talking about this nonsense? I've got real stuff going on, right? And so we have to sort of, first of all, acknowledge that students are going to respond in both of those ways and a whole host of other ways. And that part of being a good teacher is being attentive to the emotions that students are bringing into the space and creating differentiated forms of engagement based on that, right? And then the final point I'll make is just that connected to the way you said it, Simone, to me, it's really important to not gaze at suffering as part of justice-centered teaching. Like that's just a really unhealthy way. And I think it's more unhealthy when you have diverse classrooms, because the last thing you ever want to do is position some students' suffering as a benefit to other students' learning, right? That's just like a nasty way to do it. And so I think this idea of bringing up issues of justice and oppression allows us to critique those responsible and to imagine otherwises. We should spend the least amount of time gazing at the suffering that injustice causes, and the most amount of time critiquing the people who are responsible and imagining those other worlds that we think are possible.
Thank you.
I'm going to ask a question here, but I do want to encourage anybody who has a question. You can either type it in the chat. If I can't figure out how to raise hands anymore on Zoom. I think there used to be a way to do it that was easy. Now it's hidden in menus. But if you can figure it out, or you can just raise your hand like that. We have about 20 more minutes. I hope we can get some more questions in there. Oh, thank you, Eva. I'll explore that react button. So you did something interesting in chapter 4 that I hadn't seen before, and this might be an additional answer to Enrique's question about how to use this book with teachers. And that was with respect to reworking the NGSS performance expectations in the chemical composition analysis and environmental impact study assignments. And I thought that was pretty cool. Can you talk a little bit about your approach to like assignments and assessments generally, and maybe say a little more about that particular table in the book, or that way of going about it?
Yes, I will try. So part of this is just expressing my gratitude for being a part of really awesome communities of teachers here in Chicago over a really long time. I will say that sort of, I don't know if I articulate this way in the book either, but the biggest leap forward that happened in my own teaching was the summer that I met my life partner, my spouse, my significant other, Alejandra Frausto Aceves. We were in one of these teacher groups that we organized, where it would be a group of science teachers spending the summer together, working on curriculum, right? And we spent the entire summer coming up with what we called authentic assessments, which were like imagined projects for students to use the practices, concepts, skills we were teaching in real ways in the world, right? And so that's how my wife and I fell in love, was we spent a summer doing that together many years ago. And so, but that summer was the biggest leap forward in my teaching, because we had these really, I think, creative assessments that really pushed us to think about how the things we were teaching might actually matter in the world, right? And then we used this really traditional, right, lesson planning strategy of backwards mapping to sort of fill in the curriculum from there, right? And why that was powerful is because we've spent the most time trying to figure out what are students going to do at the end of this, and then we could kind of backwards map by using a whole bunch of just cool activities that science teachers already know about, that already do, that are already in textbooks, that are already online, that you may have done as a student yourself back in the day, right? That there's lots of good activities for teaching scientific concepts, right? And so the key to me was figuring out how and why those scientific concepts might actually matter in the world, and then using the activities that already exist to move students in a direction where they can use them in that way, right? And so the example in the book is teaching about the metals that are so ubiquitous in technology, whether it's copper in the circuitry, or lithium in the battery, or cobalt in the capacitors of a PlayStation or an iPhone, or all these technologies that we use in our life. And so we really wanted to think about sort of the global materials economy and issues of environmental justice and sustainability in that context, right? And so a senator from Illinois back then had introduced this Conflict Minerals Act. And so this was an opportunity for our students to write a letter to an elected official about a piece of legislation that he had proposed, and to put it in the context of things like the law of conservation of matter, things like the environmental impact of the materials economy, especially in mining communities, especially in communities that have to deal with the waste, right? And so, and it's really tough, if you've tried, to get enough science concepts and practices into a letter to an elected official to really feel as a teacher like you've assessed your students' learning in your content area, right? So we paired it with a more traditional assignment, which was a lab report about this series of experiments and lab activities that we had done around copper, and how copper is sort of processed in the electrochemistry of copper and things like that, the properties of metals. And with those as two assignments as the end goal, we were able to find lots of cool activities to build in that direction. And some of them were from things like CPUP's textbook, Science of Sustainability, or the ACS's ChemCom textbook, right? Like pretty widely available, progressive but conventional science curricula, right? And then other things are like, there was a really important passage from Eduardo Galeano's Open Veins of Latin America that served as an important piece of the curriculum, thinking about the role of metal extraction in the Spanish colonization of Latin America, right? So, and in the present day sort of residues of that process, actually, right? So that's not a traditional source for science curriculum. Or we used all these non-governmental reports about metal mining around the world as part of the science curriculum. And so I just wanted to illustrate like how we piece that together, because I think too often, at least here in Chicago, the debate about curriculum ends up being happening on these two poles, where like some people feel that like teachers have too much to do. They can't be curriculum developers. We have to give them curriculum, right? And then at the other pole, there are, and I will admit to once upon a time maybe being a little bit in this camp, feeling like all the published curriculum, has these sort of dominant ideologies built into it and is not locally responsive, and we have to build all of our curriculum from scratch, right? And I think I've come to see that both of those poles are bad places to be. Teachers are really busy and don't have a lot of time, but also we cannot rely on mass-produced curricula to do the work we need to do in classrooms. And it's also impossible to create everything from scratch. None of us have enough time in the world, and most teachers may not be as lucky as I've been to have a whole bunch of, awesome collaborators around to work with you on this, right? So the answer is somewhere in between. And for me, that's how can we come up with really cool ideas for why our subject matters in the world, and then sort of build in that direction by repurposing, reusing, borrowing, modifying, customizing cool activities that people have put together in textbooks and other published curricula. And then supplement it with some of our own designs and some critical social science texts or documentaries and things like that.
Right. And so I think in that way, it still depends on the vision of a teacher as an active, engaged intellectual who has agency over what they teach and how they teach it, which is, one could argue that that has to be continually asserted throughout one's career. It's not something that you have and then it's there forever.
Absolutely. Yeah. And also, I would argue, just to extend that point, it's also much more doable than sometimes we think it is, right? Like, classrooms are surveilled, but it's not nearly as repressive as day to day, right? It's not nearly as repressive most of the time as we worry it is, right? So like most of the time as teachers, we're left alone in our classrooms. Now, I know I say that from the luxury of being here in Chicago in the state of Illinois, and I know that things are much more repressive in some other parts of the United States. But I would argue that even in those places, the capacity of administrators and politicians to actually know what's happening in classrooms day to day is much less than they would have us teachers believe.
Okay, I of course have plenty more questions, but I'm going to do that thing where I have some wait time. And if somebody, I can see all the attendees on my screen. I did the grid view here. If you like to ask a question, feel free to just raise your hand and unmute. We're a small enough group. We can do that and pose your question.
I see Enrique's question, which is a good one.
Okay. Yeah, let's go ahead and read that out loud.
No, he's traveling. I'll read it, or you can.
Okay, yeah, sure.
So I'm wondering how you imagine these kinds of ideas about social justice science issues showing up in K-5 when the teachers may not have had the experience with high school science and the students may not be as plugged into injustices because of age. It's a really good question. It's not at all unfair, although I will start answering by admitting that I've never taught students younger than 9th grade. So my only experience with smaller children comes from raising them as a parent. So I would kind of say a couple of things about the possibilities and constraints of doing the kind of teaching that I describe in the book with younger students. The first one is that I think there is something to developmental appropriateness and not burdening children with adult problems. So we have to be thoughtful about child development and letting children be children. That's first and foremost, I think. But I will also say that children are more plugged into some injustices than sometimes we may realize. I think of something as simple as my own kid, who we're trying to raise to be a bilingual English and Spanish speaker, being at a community meeting with us when he was 3 years old. And in this community meeting, in a predominantly Latine community, the presenters in the meeting were switching back and forth between English and Spanish. And he looked at us and he was like, why are they speaking Spanish here? Right. And so our conversation that followed in that setting indicated to us that he already understood that English was dominant and that Spanish was not appropriate in public settings, that Spanish seemed to be a language of the home. And so that cued us in that a 3-year-old sort of can pick up on that hierarchy in society, right? And so I think there's that tension between we don't need to be burdening children with adult problems. We need to let them be kids. And also they pick up on more of the injustices than sometimes we give them credit for. And if they're picking up on it, then we should be addressing it, right? And so then I'll say that one of the great opportunities of teaching science in elementary school, I think, is that we don't have the disciplinary silos in the same way, right? I can't tell you how many times as a high school chemistry teacher, I felt handcuffed by like, I have to teach chemistry. I can't veer too far off into the social studies or the history or even the biology, right? Like I felt this responsibility to stay in my lane as a chemistry teacher. And that's a freedom that I'm envious of among elementary school teachers. And so, you know, I think part of my answer is that this teaching ends up being much more transdisciplinary in elementary school, where you can do it in the context of a reading lesson, you can do it in the context of a social studies or history lesson, you can do it in these much more beautiful integrated ways that don't split real problems into false disciplinary silos. And so not being an expert in elementary education, I think I will leave my answer there for now.
Thank you for the question, Enrique. Well, I think that was a fair question. Here's one that genuinely might be unfair, but I'll ask it anyway. What about science teaching in places where you have places that are dominated by privilege? So like I'm coming to you from New Jersey, where we have a highly economically and racially segregated school system. We have a small state with over 600 school districts, largely segregated by income and race. And in some of those places, people are very happy with the current setup of both science and schooling. And it's a question that I continually wrestle with, like how do you afflict the comfortable, right? Is that to use that old phrase? But I'm wondering how, and I certainly when we think about COVID and how it didn't really respect many of those lines, but it still reinscribed its effects on lines of race and class. I'm wondering how you think about social justice science issues with respect to school change among those with perhaps more power.
Yeah. It's a really good question. I have several answers to it. I mean, one thing I think of when folks ask me that question is a really great book chapter that Sarah Tolbert and Alexa Schindel wrote about this topic. So I would point folks there. I don't have the title of the article on the top of my head or the book chapter, but I think they did a good job with this question. And I would say that also, Doug, that the phrase you used, afflict the comfortable, is a good one to think about. I've talked with a really great science educator named Selena Willis about this problem too. In conversation with her, I've called it counter-hegemonic science education, right? So in some ways, the people who most need their canonical views of science challenged are the people who benefit most from the status quo, right? And so I think that it's going to look different in those settings, but these are the folks who, for the materials economy example, right? The folks who are consuming the most resources on Earth are the people who most desperately need a science education, which problematizes that for them, right? And so some of the principles that I write about in chapter 3 around social justice science issues are especially applicable here. The one I mentioned earlier about not gazing at suffering, right? We don't want to engage privileged students with thinking that they are the saviors or can somehow help out in communities that they know nothing about. But we can problematize individualized solutions to some of these problems too, right? So, buying a Tesla isn't the solution to your carbon footprint, right? But maybe advocating for more robust public transit could be.
Right.
Right.
I think you talk about that in the book as a humble stance, right? Like that, taking that humble stance towards, and using that privilege to make change, but not keep it focused on an individual.
Absolutely. And a realistic stance that our individual decisions as consumers, for example, don't make a drop in the bucket with these big problems, right? But so like if I decide to stop buying a particular product or brand that I found problematic, that doesn't do anything. But if I organize or participate in a boycott, it might, right? And so the idea that collective approaches to change are the only real approaches to change, that these individual systems might make us feel better, individual changes, but they're not any kind of solution, right? And so I think, yeah, I'll extend the idea of the importance of this kind of teaching for privileged students to also thinking about Simone's earlier question, to the students who really love science, right? Like sometimes I think people read this work and they think this is for the kids who hate science or the kids who are alienated by science. And sure, yes, that is part of what I'm talking about. But also, I think this kind of counter-hegemonic science education is most important for our young people who may be the future scientists and engineers, right? Like if we're actually going to build a more just enterprise of science, then we need part of the pre-professional education of scientists and engineers to be grappling with the socio-political context of their work. And ethics has to mean more than just handling data with integrity and treating research participants with respect and dignity. Those are absolutely fundamental, but that can't be where scientific ethics ends, right? We have to have scientists and engineers who, as part of their trajectory, are grappling with these issues all along the way, starting for sure in high school, maybe to Enrique's question a little earlier. But so this isn't just for the students who don't like the science education that they're getting right now.
I'm keeping an eye on time. Daniel Pimentel, we're going to give you a second bite at the apple here. We'll go ahead and end with your question.
Sure. We talked a bit about social justice science issues, and I hope this is also a fair question, but I'm curious, how they relate to another term that I hear used, which is socio-scientific issues. My sense is that it's not that, like, the difference between the two is not so much about the issue itself, but more about how it's framed, with like SJSI is like maybe more forefronting domination, power, systemic problems posed by the science and or systemic solutions to those scientific challenges, as opposed to socio-scientific issues. I don't think necessarily precludes those conversations, but I don't think it forefronts as much. That's just my take. I'm curious to get your take, since you clearly have really thought this through.
Yeah, no, that's exactly sort of what I would say. So I think there's two criteria that are important for me to differentiate between socio-scientific issues and social justice science issues. One is the one you just mentioned, which is that social justice science issues require us to consider critically the broader socio-political and historical context, right? So if we're raising social justice science issues, we are asking questions explicitly about domination, oppression, inequity, right? We're dealing with systems like white supremacy and heteropatriarchy and neoliberal capitalism, right? Like those are part of the context if we're talking about social justice and not just socio-scientific. The other thing is, like, we have to think about how social justice science issues show up in ways that are relevant or not to our local context and the students in the room with us, right? These aren't global issues only. They are also locally important and mean certain things in local context. And we need evidence that the way we're framing it makes sense in our students' lives and communities. And part of doing that is always foregrounding their understanding of the problem. And so that's why I talk about teachers identify social justice science issues, but then they define them in dialogue with their students, right? Teachers don't, it's not, the work is not done once we think we've identified a really cool issue to talk about. That's the beginning of the work. Then we have to redefine the issues in dialogue with our students to make sure that we understand how they're thinking about it in their lives and their communities. And then we redefine and reframe again. And then the last thing I'll say is that for me, social justice science issues are explicitly connected to Paulo Freire's ideas of generative themes, right? And so for me, that's part of that answer of what role does science education have in these longer traditions of teaching to change the world. SJSI, and I draw from a Brazilian science educator, Dos Santos, who connects the two, and he connected it with socio-scientific issues. But for me, social justice science issues is a more specific way of articulating for science educators, these are our generative themes.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, everybody. It's been a great evening. I hope I've kept up with the comments. There was one comment by Suliak about the change for US-based folks sometimes is focused on the individual, and it's harder for USians to think about change for the good of the community. I think it's a good point. So we're at time here. I want to thank Dr. Morales-Doyle for joining us today. It's a fantastic book. I encourage. I know I encourage this every month, but like it's a great book, and I'm trying to figure out ways to use it with my students and with the teachers with whom I work. So thank you so much, Danny. If you can hang on for just a minute after I close out.
Thank you, Doug, for organizing these all year. They've been wonderful. Thank you for that service to our community of science educators. I appreciate
It's a labor. It's a low stakes labor of love. It's the easiest kind. All right.
Thank everybody for joining us. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, everyone. If you want to hang out in the room for a minute, we can hang for just a second.
Sure.
Stop the recording. Okay, stop recording. Bye, everyone.